Welcome back to Anime Lockdown.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. All right, guys, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. We are NoS Anime. We're a Florida-based panel group dedicated to bringing high-quality, well-researched, and informative panels to conventions. Today, we're here to present you an examination of one of the most famous, dare we say even infamous aspects of Hideaki Anno's Neon Genesis Evangelion, its frequent use of Judeo-Christian references. The idea for this panel stems from previously experiencing discussions relating to this topic that tend to take one of two very separate yet ultimately flawed approaches. In the first case, they often read deep application of Christian theology into Evangelion's thematic discourse while actively discounting or just plain ignoring the Jewish elements of the religious references that wouldn't match a Christian worldview. The issues with this are further compounded by the fact that these discussions approach their arguments from a modern Western Christian tradition that doesn't jive with elements of Japanese Christianity. Now, the poorly appointed nature of the first case leads to the second common approach to the topic, which is to say that the Judeo-Christian references of Evangelion mean nothing, and they were mere window dressing by aloof creators who thought the stuff sounded cool. The fault with this argument is that it's often provided in a reactionary manner to someone even hinting at there being something to these references, and the result is the discounting of the creative agency of Evangelion's staff. When we look at Evangelion, however, what we see is something more in between these approaches that includes more nuance. And this led us to the idea for this panel, where we aim to make it clear that the creators of Evangelion did, in fact, do some real work when it came to selecting references. This is not to say, however, that they always did a perfect job. As we'll see, the level of dedication was extremely variable, and the quality of references could range from being quite in-depth to being utterly nonsensical. To examine this, we'll start off with a broader consideration of the topic and then narrow our focus to individual references to see this mixed level of dedication in practice. In the initial overarching section, we'll be discussing what position these Judeo-Christian references occupy in Evangelion, what production notes and the creators had to say about the issue, and then posit some thoughts as to why using such references may have attracted them. As we move on to the references themselves, each example will follow the same format. We'll start with the historical mythological background of the original reference, and then compare it to Evangelion's utilization of it to see where parallels either exist or are absent. We must note that the breadth of Evangelion's dive into Judeo-Christian names and imagery means we can't cover everything they pay homage to. For this presentation, we'll be tackling 4 religious references in particular. We'll start with Evangelion's most famous one, the angels, and then tackle 3 smaller ones that each have unique facets to them: the Spear of Longinus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Magi. By the end of the panel, it should be readily apparent to you that the inclusion of Judeo-Christian references in Neon Genesis Evangelion was purposeful and thought out, though ultimately approached with varying degrees of critical rigor by the staff. Now, a quick aside before we dive into things. Evangelion is now a franchise as opposed to a single piece of art. So we want to note that this panel will be considering Evangelion from the perspective of the original TV series and the films Death and Rebirth and End of Evangelion. The relationship between the religious references in this original version versus the new films is quite different, and so would require a separate treatment. With that out of the way, we want to start by considering what place religious references occupy in Evangelion. Before we can fully expound upon this, however, it behooves us to take a moment to clarify some literary terms which are key to this discussion: theme, symbol, and motif. A theme of a work is a message it is attempting to deliver to the audience. Themes are concepts not tied to a particular work, but rather universal to the human condition. If a work's themes revolve around, let's say, love, it doesn't really matter whether the story is set at the dawn of time or in a sci-fi world. The idea speaks to us as people. And importantly, multiple themes can be present and examined throughout the course of a work. Symbols are much simpler to think about than themes. Symbols are things in a piece of art that represent something else. Often a symbol is a physical thing that's present to represent something intangible. A black cat symbolizing the presence of evil, for example. Symbols tend to remain as such when they only occur once or a few times in a work. When multiple symbols presenting the same comparison begin showing up, though, you start to delve into the realm of our final term, motif. A motif is a recurrent symbol or idea in a work that serves to bolster one or more of its themes. Think of motifs as guideposts meant to direct you as the viewer to a theme of the work. To give you an example from Evangelion, let's think about the experiences Shinji has with trains. He goes on trains in the real world and experiences train rides alone in his mind. The environments of these real and imagined train journeys help develop ideas of isolation and the fruitlessness of escape, which play a part in the broader theme of depression. Now that we've clarified all this, the question we have to answer is, what is the function of the Judeo-Christian references in Evangelion? Well, we can assuredly state that they aren't mere symbols. They're too numerous for this. Let's think about theme then. Well, this doesn't really hold up to scrutiny either. Evangelion reaches into extremely wide-ranging baskets with Judeo-Christian references from over 2,000 years and across multiple religions and sects. We don't have the time to break it all down for you, but suffice to say, the religious themes of the works from which these references come have little to no commonality between one another, so there really isn't a through line one can find to compare against what we see in Evangelion. Those references are, however, recurrent, and they play a part in pointing us towards at least one of Evangelion's central themes. That puts these references squarely in the motif camp, a niche they occupy comfortably. But you might say, I've always heard that everyone who worked on Evangelion says the Judeo-Christian references have no meaning. How can these religious references represent a motif when the creators say it was all half-hearted and thrown together piecemeal? Well, let's take a look through some different evidence to see how these comments hold up. We're going to actually start by looking at some material from well before Evangelion aired, a document from 1993, the Neon Genesis Evangelion proposal. And this is what it sounds like, a proposal used to pitch the series. What's important for us with this document is the fact that it already hints at Judeo-Christian imagery being part and parcel to Evangelion. The Dead Sea is originally the place from which Adam initiates Second Impact, and angels are intended as the villains that our main characters fight. The proposal even goes so far as to note that while the villainous monsters are called Shito, the traditional Japanese term for apostles, they are named after angels. The usual term for angels in Japanese is tenchi, but the proposal makes their origins clear. What the proposal shows us is that the idea for using Judeo-Christian terms and imagery isn't a ramshackle idea thrown together, but rather something that was thought up from the start. Now, the proposal doesn't include notes on every reference that they end up using throughout the series, so it's likely that not everything was set in stone at this early point. That idea, however, is there, and it's pertinent to the series. Let's now move on to notable comments by some of the folks who helped make Evangelion to see what they had to say about the matter. In 1998, producer Hiroyuki Yamaga was asked about the use of these references. His response was that he really didn't know why they were used, and he assumed Anno read some books and wanted to express ideas from it. This part of the response is fairly tame. It doesn't really pull us in any direction. In that same interview, however, Yamaga noted that he was also glad that Evangelion used Judeo-Christian stuff rather than Buddhist stuff. This is because he feared that using Buddhist references might have led to unwanted comparisons to Aum Shinrikyo, the cult that perpetrated the 1995 sarin gas attack in Tokyo. Now, we don't think about it nowadays, but the Aum Shinrikyo attack was a major cultural touchstone of Japan in the 1990s. While the cult was styled around some ideas from Buddhism, it also incorporated other parts of Christian thought into their message, so artistic works that did the same, such as Evangelion, could suffer from the comparison. In this environment, we don't think it's too surprising that the people working on Evangelion might have wanted to be mum or even dismissive of their use of Judeo-Christian imagery in order to downplay any sort of possible comparison. Another famous comment downplaying the use of these references comes from assistant director Kazuya Suramaki's 2001 Otakon panel. When he was asked about the use of the cross, he noted that while they wanted Evangelion to have a religious theme, the Christian stuff was there mostly because it was uncommon and mysterious. He said there was no Christian meaning and it was all meant to look cool. And we would wholeheartedly agree with this statement, and it really doesn't much impede our argument that these references represent motif rather than theme. Evangelion does play with some themes that are also present within facets of Christianity, but as Tsurumaki notes, these are more themes present in a number of religions as opposed to anything solely connected to Christianity. Then you have the comments from 2003 by Toshio Okada, a producer who blew off the use of these references by saying that Anno never read the Bible and just picked some terms from it. Now, this is just a silly argument to make because, as we'll see, when looking at those references, much of the stuff they end up using isn't even remotely related to stuff you can find in the Bible. But so far, we've skipped out on hearing from probably the most important figure we can look to, the creator of Evangelion himself, Hideaki Anno. Anno has had a lot to say regarding the use of Judeo-Christian references over the years, and as we'll see, it's hard to pin down his feelings as a lot of what he says ends up being contradictory. Anno discussed the topic as early as 1996, where he mentioned that he hadn't really been influenced by Christianity, but since he wasn't a believer, he wasn't fearful of using all the names he found available to him. In 1997, Anno said, quote, "I'm obviously not from a Christian upbringing, so they will have to excuse me from borrowing certain Christian words and images," end quote. So at least from this early time, we can see pretty candid stuff from Anno saying that the use of Judeo-Christian imagery was purposeful, though not central to Evangelion's themes. In 1999, however, Anno was extremely dismissive of the idea behind the term Evangelion and says it was just there because it sounded complicated. Then again, in 2000, Anno noted that the stuff relating to eschatology being the study of the end times of mankind and different belief systems, that this stuff was all made up, and a lot of the Christian stuff was just pedantry looked up in simple dictionaries. Now, these statements are incongruous with what we've seen with the proposal indicating early thought to the use of these references and Anno's own previous statements. Also, to be frank, if most of the references they dug up came from simple dictionaries, we would like to have Anno define what he means by that. Most of the references they use in Evangelion are minor, extra-biblical facets of Judeo-Christian mysticism from well after the latest books of the Bible. These statements are also somewhat contradictory to a comment Anno made also again in 2000, where he stated, quote, "I don't understand Christianity at all. It was because of the atmosphere," end quote. This statement is more in line with his previous comments on the subject, and it's this idea of using Christianity for its atmosphere that we want to run with as we transition to thinking about why it was that Ava's creators dipped into Judeo-Christian references as a motif for their show about giant robots fighting monsters. Now let's get the obvious part out of the way. The Judeo-Christian references they use in Evangelion are most definitely cool and unique, and something that would have been way out of left field to Japanese audiences seeing the show for the first time. You can't deny that this all gives Evangelion an immediate and unique imprint compared to what had come before. But Anno's statement about using these references for their atmosphere belies their mere use as window dressing. Multiple uses of reference in order to develop a particular atmosphere are right in line with the function of a motif being used in a work to bolster a theme. So let's think about what theme explored in Evangelion would benefit from Judeo-Christian references as a motif to direct the audience to its presence. Well, that would be the theme of apocalypse. You have to remember that apocalypse literally means to uncover or to reveal. And one of the central facets of this show is Shinji and the other characters constantly uncovering things about themselves, for good or for ill, as they exist in a twisted world of secrets and lies, the truth of which is slowly revealed to them. It helps that the uncovering of the characters' feelings and the revelations of the world they exist in take place in the course of a literal apocalypse of mankind, in the more commonly understood sense of the world experiencing a fantastical end times. But why would Japanese creators turn to Judeo-Christian references for eschatological matters? Well, let's look at what they had that would have been more familiar. Shinto doesn't have much in the way of eschatological stories, so that's out of the running pretty quick. Buddhist eschatology is also comparatively limited. There is the Sermon of the Seven Sons, but this tale is more focused on the broad eschatological sense of the end of humanity without a lot of the nuance of apocalypse. Maitreya is the most famous and influential consideration for Buddhist eschatology, and it has come into Japan through the guise of the Nichiren sect of Buddhism. There are these bombastic, world-ending versions of Maitreya out there, but Nichiren Buddhism doesn't have any of these. Do you know where you can go to get lots of apocalyptic stuff with all sorts of pomp and circumstance, thoroughly mixed in with some genuinely freaky imagery? That's right, Judaism and Christianity. These religions have the right kind of eschatological themes for what Evangelion is after, with the world coming to an end times, with a lot of cool things happening, but ultimately there's some kind of world remaining once all is said and done. The most famous of this is the Apocalypse of John, better known to us as Revelations, but there are oodles of apocalypses out there. Christian writers picked up the idea of apocalyptic writing from Judaism, which was producing them from well before Jesus was even around. And there are many extant Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writings, and most of them had a Japanese translation by the time Evangelion's creators were doing their work, so they would have had access to this material. So what you have is a series of creators out there looking to explore some themes in a show that include the world coming to an end as revelations occur to the characters and in the plot, and all the while they're trying to give this art a character that will differentiate it on the market. It's really not surprising then that you'd end up with the preponderance of Judeo-Christian references in Evangelion. They just work really well on every level for this purpose. So now that we've considered what function these references serve in Evangelion and thought more about their inclusion, it's time to start checking out the references themselves. We've been blathering on about how Evangelion staff went out of their way to include these names and images, but exactly how much work did they do, and how well did they do it? Thinking about this will occupy the remainder of the panel as we look at particular Judeo-Christian references from the show. Now, speaking of the end of the world, we're going to start by taking a look at a major set of characters in Evangelion who are also pretty much staples of any good apocalypse: the angels. So let's begin by looking at what angels are and where they come from. Now, there's thousands of years of angelic history, so it's hard to pin them down exactly, but one can generally define angels as semi-divine heavenly beings that serve God and execute his will. The earliest depictions of angels come from the pre-exilic period of Judaism, so about 1 millennium BCE through the middle of the 6th century BCE. In these earliest times, there are three main functions of angels that become increasingly codified with time. Firstly, angels function as members of the divine council. The early concept of the Jewish god, Yahweh, was that of a king surrounded by a court of counselors and other political subordinates. Though they weren't originally defined as such, angels were eventually seen as the ones holding these positions. Secondly, angels were the warriors of Yahweh, who battled for and with him. Finally, we have their role as messengers of God, which ends up being their most prominent role throughout history. Now, we do have to think here about a broader sense of the word messenger, as the term originally used, malach, refers to beings that do a wide range of tasks. They deliver messages to prophets, announce births, call on people to serve God, reveal the future to people, protect believers of God, and act as agents of God's punishment. At this time, however, angels are not individualized. They lack agency. They are a messenger of God, but it's the message and not the messenger which is important. By the time we get to the Second Temple period from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE, we see the codification of angels with distinct form and agency in a way that we'd recognize today. This is when you start getting angels with particular names for the first time, along with distinctive hierarchies of angels relative to their closeness with God. Angels at this time also begin to be viewed as controllers of certain physical processes and concepts, which we'll see in a lot of our angels used in Evangelion. We also get increased ranges to the tasks angels take, as they very prominently act as teachers and mediators of revelation. When Christianity emerges and takes up angels into its thinking, they hold the same roles as messengers, with no diminished capacity for violence. After the 1st century CE, however, Judaism and Christianity drifted apart, and while their beliefs on the general roles of angels remained the same, a lot of the particulars became different. We don't have time to dig into how these and other religions that included angels changed their thinking on them over time, but importantly, the bits we've covered here get us through the development of the general concept of angels as they exist even to this day. And angels went through all these changes. Their descriptions also varied considerably. Now, the earliest depictions of angels don't give us much, given the lack of agency we mentioned. Once you do start having angels described in more detail, though, you get a whole smorgasbord of different looks to them. Angels can look like any regular dude or soldier. They can be humans radiating light or glowing like coals. They might appear grotesque in golden armor, have multiple arms, be made of different materials like metal, precious stones, fire, half water. They can be ethereal like phantoms or specters. They can walk, have wings and fly. Some have no knees. Maybe they're serpent-shaped with 6 wings, either radiating light or being on fire. And sometimes they look so nice that they're lusted after by people. Something that happens with Evangelion's angels, he said, looking at all you Kaoru fans out there. Now, the ultimate example for how bonkers angels could look comes from the prophet Ezekiel, who describes a creature eventually deemed to be an angel as follows. A wheel in a wheel with eyes along the edges, hands, wings, flesh, backs, and 4 faces, that of a man, lion, eagle, and cherub. Mind you, it can also be read as having 16 faces with a cow's face thrown in there for good measure. So this gives us the background for where angels come from, what they do, and what they look like. So let's see how well they matched up to Evangelion's depictions of them. Now, there are a few key ways in which Ava's angels don't gel with classic angelic lore. Despite being angels and thus ostensibly messengers, Ava's angels are really poor at communicating with humanity. The closest they ever come to this outside the finale of End of Evangelion is when certain angels attack the psyche of the Ava pilots in an attempt to garner further means of attack. The angels are also not in any particular hierarchical structure. While the angels themselves become increasingly dangerous as time passes throughout the show, the angels they're based on are not of any particular note. Lastly, unlike angels as viewed throughout history, Ava's creatures are not directly connected to the will of their progenitor, Adam. Now, this is a fundamental aspect of angels from mythology, and only fallen or otherwise evil angels become disconnected from the will of God. But here's also where we start to see the similarities that connect Ava's angels to their historical counterparts. While the angels might not be ever connected to Adam, they are not fallen, as their ultimate goal in the show remains to enact Adam's will of defeating Lilith and her progeny. In this role as beings out to destroy the competition of their creator, Ava's angels fulfill one of the basic functions of the angelic messenger, as they enact wrathful vengeance upon the world. Just as angels of history utilized violence against people on Earth to deliver a message of God's displeasure, so too do the show's angels act in this manner on behalf of Adam. And we can't forget the ever-present theme of apocalypse that surrounds the show. We know that angels are integrally linked with the historical concept of apocalypse, and what do we get in Evangelion? Well, the show is begun by an apocalypse caused by one angel, ended by another apocalypse caused by 2 angels and a depressed 14-year-old, and most episodes are based around some new, wacky angel trying to instigate an apocalypse. And these angelic interactions also serve as one of the marked ways in which the show inculcates us with the less literal, more revelatory concept of apocalypse through various episodes. And finally, we have the designs of the angels themselves. Anno noted that the angels took many forms because they were meant to be the enemy, and to him the enemy was ambiguous. Given the vast array of angelic depictions throughout history, the idea of your weekly villains being a bunch of disconnected, weird monsters works perfectly well for angels. So looking at it in this general sense, what we see with Evangelion's use of angels is a pretty solid, if imperfect, attempt to connect historical and mythological angels to their depictions and functions in Evangelion, as they act as one of its religious references serving in the function of motif. So while we know they did a pretty decent overall use of angels, let's now take the time to dig into the individual angels of the show and see whether the same scrutiny carried over as they picked real angels to match up to their giant monster designs. Now we're going to start with the villain of the weak angels and work our way through to the progenitor beings, Adam and Lilith, and we'll use Evangelion's internal numbering system for the angels. So let's begin with the third angel, Sakiel. His name means covering of God, and Sakiel of myth is a cherubim. If you go far enough back, however, cherubim are not in fact angels. Cherubim were originally functionaries of the divine council, where they served as supernatural guardians of Yahweh in the area above the Ark of the Covenant where Yahweh would manifest. And later on, they became associated with the transport of Yahweh. The most influential description of cherubim come from Ezekiel, who describes their quadrupedal nature and the presence of multiple faces. It's around the Second Temple period that cherubim begin to be viewed as classes of angels within a defined hierarchy. Now, Sakiel in particular shows up in medieval times, likely first in Jewish mystical tradition that bleeds into Christian angelology, where he also appears. Now, other than being an archangel of the first heaven, we don't have a lot on him. This doesn't leave a lot of comparisons between the historical Sakiel and the one we see in Evangelion. Ava's monster does reveal multiple faces, but otherwise it's referred to mostly for its aquatic characteristics, not at all concurrent with the historical angel. Next up, we get the fourth angel, Shamshel. His name means mighty son of God, and he's mentioned in the earliest source, the Book of Enoch, as a fallen angel who taught man the signs of the sun. Now, Shamshel pops up in a lot of other instances as both a fallen and a good angel, and he's described as a ruler of the fourth heaven and one who led Moses around heaven, to name just a few of his deeds. This doesn't leave a lot of connection between Shamshel of myth and the creature of the show. The tentacles he fights with are officially called whips of light, and people see a connection given the sun part of his name, but it's quite a stretch. The fifth angel is Ramiel. His name means thunder of God, and he first appears in the Book of Enoch, where, funnily enough, he's described at different points as both a fallen and a good angel. Like our other angels, he has some additional exploits throughout the ages, but his coolest one, by far, comes from the Syriac apocalypse of Baruch. This story notes that at the siege of Jerusalem in 700 BCE, Ramiel slew the 185,000 men under each of the 185,000 captains of the enemy army. That's 34.2 billion folks, if you're wondering how the math works out. If anything, it's this name and reputation that brought Ramiel to the attention of Evangelion's creators, as his attacks in the show are truly thunderous and devastating. Our sixth angel is Gagiel. His name means height of God, and he appears only once as a guard of the sixth heaven. The idea of height here is regarding size, and he is an absolutely massive bloke. So this is the only possible way one might compare him to the monster in Evangelion bearing his name, as this was one of the largest angels they fought. While not a great match on the comparative front, this does give us a good opportunity to point out a repeated issue that one comes across with Evangelion. Lots of resources for Evangelion include meanings of the names for the angels. For some of them, like Sakiel, these match up fine. For most of them, however, it's absolute hogwash. Case in point here, Gagiel's name on Evangelion websites comes up as Roaring Beast of God, which, while sweet, is 100% incorrect. All the meanings you'll see from us are translated from the original languages to ensure as much accuracy as possible. Let's move on now to the seventh angel, Israfil. Now, Israfil is an angel from Islamic mythology, and his name is literally an Arabic transliteration of Raphael, whose name means God has healed. While not mentioned specifically in the Quran, he's associated in Islam with the angel who blows the trumpet to signal the arrival of the Day of Judgment. This does give Israfil some historic connection to music throughout mythology, though it was, oddly enough, a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, Israfil, that really put his name out into the public discourse as an angel of music. So there's nothing in the lore of Israfil that gives us an insight as to why he's depicted as a dualistic entity in Evangelion, but given his defeat through musically synchronized combat, it's hard to dismiss a pretty easy and straightforward reference with this guy. Our eighth angel is Sandalphon. His name, as it comes down to us, is in Greek, and it means something like co-brother, though it Doesn't really translate literally all that well. This does make some sense, however, as Sandalphon is one of the great princely Sarim of rabbinic lore and twin of the famous angel Meteron. There are lots of stories about him, and they rarely agree with one another on what exactly he does. For our purposes, though, it's his treatment in Kabbalic lore that's pertinent. In this, Sandalphon is an important factor in the determination of the sex of the embryo of an expectant mother. Here's where we find our connection to Evangelion's angel, as he's initially discovered as a seemingly nondescript embryo in a volcano before emerging as a massive sea monster-looking doohickey. The ninth angel is Matarael. His name means reign of God, and he's only mentioned once as a guard of the first heaven. Matarael in Evangelion is purely connected through his name, if, as you'll recall, Matarael's strategy to attack Nerve headquarters was to stand above it and rain acid down until it won. Stupid plan, but pretty easy to connect the dots with the reference. Our 10th angel is Sahakiel. His name means cloud of God, and he comes to us from the 3rd book of Enoch, where he's described as a ruler of the sky. Again, with this one, it's quite straightforward. Evangelion's angel is falling from the sky. Fine name of angel associated with the sky. Pat yourself on the back, have an early lunch. The 11th angel is Ireuel. Now, this isn't an angel whose name you can translate, as unlike all the others, this one is made up. There is no angel from mythology known as Ireuel. Now, the first couple of Hebrew letters of his name do correspond to the letters within a word meaning terror or fear in Hebrew, but the only biblical reference that one could match to as written would be a patch of wilderness called Jeruel, which meant founded by God. This is where you have to consider that Hebrew doesn't technically have vowels, just consonants among which are included vowel markers. Or, in the case of ancient Hebrew, you just had to wing it from context. You didn't have this modern crutch of vowel markers. It's hard to tell if this was a case of mistaken translation of a real word versus someone just putting things together, but ultimately it doesn't much affect the final product we see in Ava. The 12th angel is Leliel. His name means Knight of God, and sources variously describe him in a positive light as being assigned to guard spirits at their birth, or negatively as a prince of conception. This is a case where Evangelion's creators took the inspiration for their creature from both the name of the angel, with the dark void into which Ava Unit 1 sinks being a bottomless pit of night, and the mythological consideration of Leliel's connection to conception and birth, with the quite literal and gory birth of Ava Unit 1 from the spherical part of Leliel after its capture. The 13th angel is Bardiel. His name means Hail of God, and that's about as much as we get on him. As we noted before, many angels are associated with physical phenomenon, and as you can see here, that can be as far as the lore goes. That really doesn't do much for our comparison to Evangelion's Bardiel, who's much less falling frozen water and more infectious viral entity. The 14th angel is Zeruel. His name means arm of God, and he comes to us from a source called the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, in which he's described as an angel set over strength. Now, this source is from the 1st-2nd century CE, which is when the angels start gaining command over physical characteristics, and for Zeruel, his dominion over strength makes him quite formidable. Now, this is another case of name and myth coming together, with Ava's angel giving the incredible thrashing that it does to the Ava pilots using those viciously strong toilet paper arms. Our 15th angel is Arael. His name means Lion of God, and this guy has a whole slew of various stories about him, wherein he can be good or evil, he might rule over the waters or the winds, and you even see him referenced by the likes of Shakespeare and Shelley. Unfortunately, none of these tales about Arael involve him being a giant cockatiel-looking light bulb of doom that attacks people with psychic beams. Now, the name you often see for Arael in Evangelion stuff is Light of God, and for once at least, to their credit, some very old versions of the word light or a single mythed letter of modern Hebrew could fool someone to this translation, so we might have here a case of mistaken identity. The 16th angel is our Misael. Lore-wise, he's described in the Talmud as the angel who governs the womb and is invoked in difficult childbirth. This guy's name was quite difficult, and the best translation we could come up with amounts to something like enclosure of the children of God, which does seem to fit his station. The connection to Evangelion's Ar Misael almost certainly stems from the association with the womb, as after he infects Ava Unit 0 appears very much pregnant before it eventually blows up. There is also the fact that in bonding with Unit 0, a tower bursts forth from the Evangelion that displays an amalgamation of all the previous angels, and this could be a play on the translation of his angelic name. Our final villain angel is the 17th angel, Tabriz, better known to us as Nagisa Kaoru. The only reference we get to Tabriz notes him as an angel of free will. It makes the reason Evangelion's creators picked him pretty straightforward. Kaoru, as Adam incarnate, is the only angel to display free will, as opposed to being single-mindedly set upon devastation. Tabriz's name, though, is a special case, and we want to dive into it a bit. He's often described as an angel from Islam, with an Arabic name that you see translated as the emerged, revealed, or arisen. The only reference to him, however, comes from the Noctameron by Apollonius of Tyana, a 1st century CE Neo-Pythagorean philosopher from Cappadocia. Now, having done a lot of detective work, we came to two possible conclusions. First option, the Achaemenid Old Persian word patibar, meaning bring back or restore, came through the languages of separate conquerors 1,000 years apart to beget Tabriz's name. Second option, this guy made him up. This is Eliphas Levi, a late 19th century French occultist author. So, which option isn't? Well, funnily enough, there isn't an angel in Islam called Tabriz, and the Noctameron by Apollonius was actually written by Levi, though to his credit, he did summon a shade of Apollonius, so maybe that's where he got it from. We think you can see the more likely of these two options. Now that will complete our Monster of the Week angels and brings us to the two unique creatures of Evangelion, Adam and Lilith. In Ava, these beings are called seeds of life. They were sent by the first ancestral race to become the progenitors of life on various worlds. Earth was Adam's planet, but Lilith crash-landed and superseded Adam as the creator of life. Adam's awakening by mankind is what caused all the shenanigans that began Evangelion, as Adam was kind of miffed about having his planet taken from him, so he caused second impact. Before he could be fully subdued, he begat the angels that we've been discussing, and in order to combat them, Nerve created the Evangelions from these same seeds of life. Just like the other angels, these two are also Judeo-Christian references. So let's begin with the first angel, Adam. His name means either human singular or humankind in a plural sense. In Abrahamic religions, Adam is seen as the first human created by God in the Garden of Eden. In the original Hebrew of Genesis, his individuality does eventually become evident, but initially the fact that the word Adam can be singular or plural is played up for ambiguity. One of the purposes of the story of Eden is to show how Adam, the man, experiences difficulties that will be reflected in the collective lives of Adam in the sense of all mankind. There's also the play on the connection between the word Adam and the word Adama, meaning earth. Earth is what Adam is made from and part of the root of his own name. It's Adam's disobedience of God in Eden that causes the earth to be cursed, and mankind, as a result, becomes estranged from the earth. Now, unsurprisingly, Adam has become the focus of many Jewish and Christian writers over the millennia. There are too many traditions to go over with Adam overall, but a couple may be pertinent to us. Firstly, in certain circles starting around the 2nd century BCE, Adam was viewed as being a superhuman giant with immense powers before being punted out of Eden. Secondly, some myths describe Adam as being made of the pure light of creation. If you know what Adam looks like from the brief moments we get to see him in Evangelion, you can see the connection here, as Ava's Adam is an inordinately powerful giant creature that seems to be made of bright white light. Beyond that, the connection between Adam of myth and Adam of Evangelion transcends mere descriptive considerations. Adam is the first being on Earth from whom intelligent life was to sprout before he was ousted from his position, and in a quite literal sense, estranged from the Earth that was rightfully his. So this may not be a reference that dives into the deepest lore out there, but a solid one nonetheless. Now, that being who ousted him is our final angel we'll be looking at, the second angel, Lilith. Unlike with Adam, the origins of Lilith are a little less definitive, so we'll need to examine her from a few different angles. Let's start with the single mention of the word Lilith from the Bible, which comes from Isaiah. While this mention of Lilith was often translated as a name, it actually just means screech owl. The place it comes from is essentially a list of unclean animals. Thus, while the word for screech owl is written just like Lilith, reading her name into it would be akin to having David Attenborough listing animals on a program and him randomly throwing Cthulhu in there. To find Lilith for the first time, we actually need to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. In one of the portions called Song of the Sages, Lilith is mentioned amongst a number of creatures whom the speaker frightens away with the invocation of God's name. While we don't get any detail on her, the lack of any description must indicate that she was a known entity present within Jewish belief by the 1st century CE. In the next period where we get concentrated references to Lilith, we get some dichotomy to her character. We're talking here about the Near East from the 4th to 9th century CE. This is where many of the writings comprising the Talmud come from, and Lilith is mentioned more than a few times here, with things like her looks and lists of the nasty things that she does. But we also need to look away from highbrow religious texts to some more mass market material in the form of spell bowls. These are ceramic bowls discovered under the thresholds of houses from the 6th to 7th century CE Jewish communities in Sassanid Persia. Spell bowls are plain in shape, with magic text lining the bowl's interior, and they may include a symbol or drawing of a demon or spirit down at the bottom of the bowl. The bowls would be used to trap malevolent spirits as they attempted to enter a place. Lilith appears in these incantations as well, but the Lilith we see isn't always singular. Sometimes Lilith is a unique demon, like from this example here on the left, in which the spell around her is actually a magical divorce decree to ward her off. But there are also these Lilith with a small l, viewed as a class of creature. As none of our Talmudic or other religious texts from this time deal with these little l Liliths or with spell bowls at all, what we see here is the common people's reflection on their religion. Importantly, by this time, in both elite writings and commoner magic, we see Lilith in all her forms being known for certain things that are her hallmarks throughout history. She appears at night, attacks children with particular violence, and promotes sexual deviancy in men. These are some of the key features of the most famous version of Lilith, which comes to us from the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a text from somewhere between the 8th to 10th century CE. While this text is likely satire to some extent, the story it provides about Lilith really codifies her into Jewish mythology, and the tale reflects the general view of her origins and demeanor between the time it was written all the way through the modern day. The Lilith of the Alphabet of Ben Sira presents her as the first wife of Adam. If this seems odd, remember that the first book of the Bible, Genesis, has 2 creation stories. In the first, God creates mankind, but it's only in the second one that we get the whole man first, then a woman bit. At some point, Jewish mythical tradition picked up on this, and it became lore that there was a first wife of Adam before Eve, and for whatever reason, Lilith began to occupy this role. The story as presented in the Alphabet of Ben Sira about Lilith boils down to: God created Adam and Lilith together. Lilith refuses to be subservient to Adam during sex. She gets mad and flies away. Adam asks God to get her back, so God sends some angels after her. She tells them to piss off and decides instead to become a demon who sprouts prodigious amounts of other demons and harms the children of men. Now, this view of Lilith as the disobedient wife of Adam turned to a demon for her crimes against God's order comes together with other traditions to give her a pretty singular view in Jewish mysticism. And when occultism touched off in the 19th century, Lilith became popular within the movement. And in the early 20th century, she gained another facet of her character important to us: her association with Earth's second hidden moon, the black moon of Lilith, it's often called. So as you can see, Lilith has a lot of background to her, and frankly, we've only scratched the surface. Where we see the Lilith of Evangelion connect to the mythical Lilith is in the latter part of these traditions with her origin stories. Just as how Lilith of myth is created with Adam but messes the whole thing up, so too was the Lilith of Evangelion created together as a seed of life before proceeding to mess everything up by superseding Adam on his own planet. Additionally, just as Lilith is said to spew demons en masse, so too does Lilith of Evangelion do so in her own way through the creation and spread of mankind. Evangelion's creators also ducked into modern occult perceptions with things like the Black Moon, which the show's Lilith arrived on. But otherwise, there aren't any real connections between Lilith's design in the show and any of her descriptions from myth. Thus, what we get with our last angel is a case of clear connection to the reference behind Evangelion's creature, but one that doesn't dig all that deeply into the past of said reference. Now that will finish up our treatment of the angels of Evangelion, but as we all know, angels are not the only Judeo-Christian reference the show utilizes. We're going to finish off by taking a look at 3 comparatively minor references, but ones that each have unique facets to them. Let's start with the Spear of Longinus. In Evangelion, the Spear of Longinus is a separate living entity that travels with a seed of life. In the case that 2 seeds arrive on the same world, the spear acts as a failsafe, and one of the seeds is shut down to prevent competition. Lilith's spear was either lost or destroyed when she landed on Earth, which is why Adam was turned off by his spear, and her creations allowed to conquer the planet. Removing Adam's spear was what allowed him to wake up and cause second impact. Now, the Spear of Longinus is special because it combines both a Judeo-Christian religious reference, the Spear of Longinus, with a Greco-Roman reference, the caduceus, and the background of both affect the final product we see in Eva. So let's start with the mythical Spear of Longinus. This is known to be the spear that a Roman soldier thrust into the side of Jesus of Nazareth to check and see whether or not he had actually died on the cross. Now, the spear is only mentioned in the Gospel of John. The other Gospels do mention an unnamed centurion as being present at the crucifixion, and some have that centurion declaring the divinity of Jesus, but there is no spear. Our first mention of the spear owner's name being Longinus comes from a text called the Acts of Pilate, which probably came out around the 4th century CE. In the following centuries, the unnamed centurion became conflated with Longinus as the wielder of the spear. The earliest stories of Longinus actually show him being punished for stabbing Jesus, but eventually the tradition developed that he was an early convert to Christianity and he eventually became a saint. Now, the physical spear as a religious relic, often called the Holy Lance, is first mentioned in the 6th century CE, and together there are at least 4 of them nowadays that are around. It's through these relics that a lot of the mythos surrounding the spear developed. The spear was seen as responsible for a slew of miracles over the years, but their most famous exploits were in their role as divine weapon. Good Christians could bring the spear with them into battle to help assure victory, like a martial talisman of sorts, but the stories also talked about more direct ability. When the spear pierced Jesus' side, what came out was blood and water, a physical manifestation of his human and divine characteristics. And thus the spear became imbued with the special power to slay any enemy. Besides the name, this mythology of the spear is where Evangelion goes for its reference. The Spear of Longinus in Evangelion has the special property of being able to penetrate the AT field of any angel, and consequently it can kill any opponent the Eva's face. One also can't forget that the primary means of storing the spear before it gets used against Ariel is stabbed into Lilith up on a giant cross with LCL draining from the wound. It's not exactly a subtle visual. But as we mentioned, it's not just the Spear of Longinus that Ava's creators look to, but also the caduceus. The caduceus is the staff traditionally carried by Hermes in Greco-Roman mythology. It gets its name from the Greek word kerukion, which translates to herald staff, and its basic appearance is of 2 snakes intertwined around or atop a pole. In ancient mythology, the caduceus itself represents Hermes, as opposed to being a tool that imbues particular power in and of itself. Now, Hermes is remembered as the messenger god, but his overarching domain is actually over boundaries. All the ancient protectorates of Hermes would have some connection to movement outside normal boundaries of civilization, such as trade, but also movement between the boundaries of the mortal and divine realms, which is why Hermes acts as the messenger for the gods. The caduceus does have particular connotations in the ancient world as a sign of peace, another example of boundaries, as peace restores the appropriate line between opponents. After Greco-Roman times, the caduceus does gain some agency, such as in the occultic practices of the 19th century, where the caduceus is recognized as having some powers on its own, such as the ability to put the awake to sleep and to awaken the sleeping. With the caduceus, we actually see more connection to the spear of Longinus in Evangelion. The design of the spear itself is very reminiscent of the caduceus, with its intertwining portions just below the 2 points of the spear matching up quite well. The spear in Evangelion is also an entity very much concerned with boundaries. It's able to put a seed of life to sleep to maintain peace on a planet, for example. Also, that ability to pierce AT fields also brings up the idea of boundaries, as AT fields in Evangelions are the boundaries between the souls of individual beings. In the finale of End of Evangelion, when the Human Instrumentality Project is coming to a climax to create a singular form of mankind without boundaries between individuals, the Spear of Longinus plays a pivotal role in both instigating and ending this act. Thus, with the Spear of Longinus, we get a case of Avis creators sticking with the kind of references they were using for most of the show, but also dipping their toes into some other areas. The next reference we want to look at is the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Evangelion, the Dead Sea Scrolls were a set of texts written by the first ancestral race, which ended up in the hands of Sele. These texts describe how the seeds of life and the spears functioned and were prophetical, and that they were the manner through which the number and order of angels was determined. When Sele got these, the bulk of the useless information was publicly released as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the other part was kept hidden and referred to as the secret Dead Sea Scrolls. The historical Dead Sea Scrolls, though, are a little less alien in origin. They are a collection of around 1,000 biblical, apocryphal, and extra-biblical texts discovered around 1950 in caves near the ancient site of Tir Beit Qumran in modern Israel. The scrolls were hidden sometime around 70 CE, likely to keep them from being destroyed by the Romans during the First Jewish Revolt. The texts fall into one of three categories: books from the Bible, apocryphal books, and manuscripts of varying Jewish sects existing roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. The most common theory to their origin is that they were written by the community over at Qumran. Qumran was probably the settlement of a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who were known for living in communities with pooled resources and having a great emphasis on ritual purity. Amongst the texts unique to the Dead Sea Scrolls are a trove of apocalyptic writings which predicted the end times and told readers how to prepare for it. Now, this is where we find our first connection to Evangelion. Just as with the original texts, Ava's Dead Sea Scrolls were used to provide revelation on how Sele could bring about their own apocalypse of mankind. With the use of Judeo-Christian references being targeted towards the theme of apocalypse, it makes a nice fit. But the second connection Evangelion has between the historical reference and their use of it comes more from the time in which Evangelion was actually being made. During the 90s, portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls had yet to be made public, which led to massive waves of conspiracy theory about there being something in the scrolls that was hidden. This mostly stemmed from arguments about some of the Jewish sectarian writings seeming very proto-Christian, so it was believed that the church and Western governments were forcing Israel to keep these parts secret so as not to destroy Christianity. While, in the end, this was more a case of academic pissing contests, it was a huge thing and it made it into major news outlets throughout the world. For a production like Evangelion that was going for cool factor with these references, the Dead Sea Scrolls made for a perfect connection to the secretive documents used in the show's plot. Lastly, we turn to our final reference, the Magi. In Evangelion, the Magi is a tripartite supercomputer that runs most of NERV's systems. The computer utilizes a special operating system called a Transcribed Personality OS, which downloads someone's personality onto a computer in order to give it self-awareness. Each part of the computer represents an aspect of the downloaded personality of its creator, Naoko Akagi, her as a woman, mother, and scientist. One of the unique things about this reference is that it's the only one which is noted in the show as a biblical reference. Magi, however, are not purely from the Bible. They were a Zoroastrian priestly class that first appear in the written records of the 6th century BCE. They were a political force in the courts of various Persian empires in the ancient Near East, and they were known for their command of supernatural forces like astrology and dream reading. The Magi in the Bible come from a single tale in the Gospel of Matthew. In this story, the Magi come from the East, and through a series of events, they deliver valuable gifts to baby Jesus. Beyond what they do and some talents they show off, though, Matthew is quite sparse on what these who these Magi were. Given the time frame of the early 1st century CE, we know they were probably Parthian noblemen, but we don't even know how many of them there were. Inevitably, their story became part and parcel to the early Christian movement, with writings about them and art depicting them appearing by the 3rd century CE. By this time, we get the idea of there being 3 Magi, almost certainly because they brought 3 gifts, and it was already prevalent in Western Christian tradition. Not too long after, by the early 6th century CE, there was already tradition of not only 3 Magi, but of their names, Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior being the most common versions. From this point through the later Middle Ages, depictions of the Magi typically had them shown as you see here on the left, roughly the same age and dressed in typical Eastern attire with trousers. After this, however, there was a movement to present the Magi in a new manner. This imagery became known as the Adoration of the Magi, and one of the key aspects of this art was that the Magi were shown with different ages, one young, one middle-aged, and one old. There's an example here on the right. Now, this change stemmed from the Magi being seen as representing the entirety of mankind, all of whom could and should worship Jesus. Minor changes aside, this general view of the Magi remains with us to this day. In Evangelion, despite the presence of the Magi over the course of the entire show, the extent to which they try to match the references is almost exclusively limited to the names of the 3 parts of the computer, matching to the 3 most common names for the biblical Magi. Where this differs is in the single episode that focuses on the Magi, episode 13. In this episode, Ritsuko Akagi, the daughter of the person whose brain was downloaded to create the computer, successfully defeats Ereul, and then goes on to discuss with Misato how her mother designed the different components of the Magi to represent different facets of her. Now, this is an individualistic play on how the Magi are viewed in modern Christian art as containing in their persons the facets of all humanity. The fact that Ritsuko's mother's decision to do this was for the purposes of creating a system to balance itself with reason means, however, that, like the choice of the reference itself, including it was little more than a minor nod to the biblical Magi, as opposed to some deep connection to the theology surrounding them. And that is where we're forced to leave it off for the day. While we haven't been able to look at every religious reference that Evangelion uses throughout its runtime, this exercise has let us answer the questions we set out to. Was the use of Judeo-Christian references purposeful and thought out? Well, there's no doubt about it, really. The proposal and statements of the creators themselves combine with overwhelming evidence to show that this was the case. Was their use merely haphazard window dressing? Not really. The function of these references as a motif to drive one of the show's themes, and their use as something to set Evangelion apart from the crowd, speaks to a concerted effort in their inclusion. Was every single example of a reference a deep dive into the lore and theology behind it? Absolutely not. It's a veritable mixed bag of quality. As we've seen in some of our examples, there was real dedication to the choice of references in general and on some of the specifics within that, but they weren't above flat out picking names that looked cool or just making stuff up. When all is said and done then, what's the end result of all of this work for Evangelion? Well, in a show packed to the gills with great characters, superb mecha and monster design, solid themes, incredible animation, and a whole slew of other references to boot, the deliberate addition of another layer of complexity with religious references only further enhances the experience for us in the audience. Frankly, in the end, it just makes Evangelion all that much cooler. And that is where we will end it for today. So that does leave us a few minutes. One important thing to note, here's where you can find us on social media. This is our newest panel that we've just worked on. So for this one on our Tumblr page, we're beginning with this one. You can go on there and find the bibliography of sources we used. So the various things we read, interviews, etc. So if you'd like to go there and see our sources, feel free. Otherwise, I will go ahead and let John Paul do a couple of minutes of Q&A.
Oh, it's 12 o'clock now.
Okay.
We're at the top of the hour. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So if anyone has questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump on to the Discord. I'm just going to go hop into the overpriced bar. If you have any questions, feel free and jump in there and ask them, and I'll do my best to answer a few of the questions before the next panel starts.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this year.
Of course,
cheers.
thank you for having us.